Hi, everybody. It's so nice to see you. We are here to listen to Robert Harris, who barely needs an introduction. We know him and love him for his novels about the Second World War, Fatherland, Enigma, Munich, about Stalin, Archangel, about ancient Rome, Pompeii, and the Cicero trilogy. I think what's remarkable about Robert is his books sell by the millions. His current book, which we're going to talk about, is in the bestseller list and has been in the bestseller list for many weeks already. He also has a very good track record in creating books which go on to make terrific films and TV adaptations. And then the third arm to Robert is he is a critical hit. All the critics love him. His new novel has had rave reviews. One reviewer said it was his best novel since Fatherland. And reading the Sunday Times this morning, the outgoing literary editor of Andrew Holgate said that the 23 best books of the 21st century included Officer and a Spy, which was Robert's novel about the Dreyfus affair. Did you happen to see that, Robert?
I did, oddly enough. I was running down this. He'd been literary editor or associated with the pages for 23 years, and he said, here are my 23 favourite books. And I read on and on down the list with growing impatience, and then finally he saw the light. So what a great list it was.
But now for something different. The new novel, Act of Oblivion, is a thriller set in the 17th century. It's new territory for you. It's about the English Civil War, its aftermath, and the hunt for Oliver Cromwell's colonels who were wanted for the murder of Charles I. It's a novel about a country divided by two competing ideologies, a country that has a pandemic, a King Charles on the throne.
I see where you're going.
The timing is impeccable. But Robert, take us through the scene. Where are we? England, 1660.
England, 1660, has been a republic for 11 years, incredibly. England, a republic in the 17th century, 150 years before the French, 250 years before the Russians. We got there first. But Cromwell is dead, the only man who could hold the show together, and eventually Parliament decides that astonishingly, really, they need a king again. And the candidate, obviously, is Charles I's son, who becomes Charles II. And a deal is done with him to bring him back. And the deal is really the Act of Oblivion. The Act of Oblivion, a very sophisticated piece of legislation which said we will forget all the so-called crimes of the Civil War, taking up arms against the king and so on. We won't make anything out of that. And indeed they did stick to it, and the new royalist regime never moved against any member of the Cromwell family, for instance, including Cromwell's two sons, Richard and Henry. Richard, who had been Cromwell's successor, lived to a great age, I think about 90, completely unmolested. The only exception to this sweetness and light was anyone who'd had a hand in the death of Charles I. They were required to surrender themselves for, quotes, the king's mercy. And there were 59 signatories of the death warrant, of whom more than 30 were still alive when Charles II came back, and there were scores of men who'd acted as his judge. And they were to be prosecuted. And about 25 to 30 handed themselves in the hope of mercy. Big mistake, because there was really to be no mercy, and a lot of the rest went on the run, including two who were the really subjects of this novel, who fled to New England. So the novel is really about the beginnings of America in a way, and a manhunt across New England that went on for year after year in the 1660s.
You want to read a short passage from your book? Just give us the...
Okay.
The opening scene. It's such a powerful opening scene, which I think really immediately draws you into the story.
Yeah, I'll just set it up. The novel opens on Friday, the 27th of July, 1660. I'm a kind of nerd, really. I love getting the right days of the week. You know, what day of the week was the 27th of July? It was a Friday. The phases of the moon, all that sort of thing I'm obsessed with. Anyway, on Friday the 27th of July, these two men arrived in America. They were Colonel Edward Whaley. Throughout the writing of the novel, I thought his name was Colonel Edward Wally, which gave me a great many difficulties. because the inevitable line, "Where's Wally?" constantly suggested itself. In fact, I should have realised that because his family crest was 3 spouting whales, his name was Whaley. So Colonel Edward Whaley, who was Cromwell's cousin, he was 60. He was the same age as Cromwell. He was, I think, must have been very close to Cromwell. They were at Cambridge at the same time. They lived briefly in London together. When Cromwell raised his regiment at the beginning of the Civil War, there were 5 troops of cavalry. He put Whaley in charge of one of them. He made Whaley Commissary General of Horse, in command of the cavalry of the whole army. And when Cromwell was Lord Protector, he lived next door to him and was effectively in charge of his private security. So they were very close. And not only that, Whaley had also had custody of the king for 8 months during the Civil War when he was captured.
An enormously powerful figure.
Powerful figure who'd seen both these key figures, Cromwell and Charles, close up, and even got on reasonably well with Charles I. His son-in-law, William Gough, completely different kettle of fish, 42 years old at the time they arrive in America. He was a radical, he was a visionary, a fifth monarchist man. He had visions from God about how they should deal with the king. He spoke at the Putney debates. The notion of these two men on the run together amused me. I was very devoted to my late father-in-law, but I would not have liked to have gone on the run with him, hiding out in barns and attics and in the open. So I was attracted by these two figures. Those were the two I chose to focus on. The nature of their relationship, the nature of the two men and what they represented, and the landscape of New England in the 1600s.
Which comes across so well. I'd love to ask you more about that.
So this little passage from the book, don't worry, it's only 3 pages, is they arrive. There was a family in Cambridge, Massachusetts, called the Gookin family, lived close by the Charles River, ironically named after the dead king, and the shadow of Harvard College, which had already been built. And the master of the house, Daniel Gookin, had gone back to England for 2 years. He was collector of customs under Cromwell. Cromwell dies. The family expects his return. They're told that his boat has anchored. They wait for him excitedly. 5 children and his wife. They haven't seen him for 2 years. A cart comes across the ferry from the Charles River. It is their father returning. Oh, and he has 2 men with him, and that's the opening of the novel. In the immediate flurry of kisses and embraces, of tears and laughter, of children being tossed into the air and whirled around, the pair of strangers, who remained throughout politely seated in the back of the cart among the luggage, were at first ignored. Daniel Gookin hoisted Nat up onto his shoulders, tucked Dan and Sam under either arm, and ran with them around the yard, scattering the chickens, then turned his attention to the shrieking girls. Mary had forgotten how big her husband was, how handsome, how large a presence. She couldn't take her eyes off him. Finally, Gookin set down the girls, placed his hand around her waist, whispered, "There are men here you must meet. Don't be alarmed," and ushered her towards the cart. "Gentlemen, I fear I've plain forgot my manners. Allow me to present my wife, the true prudent Mary, in flesh and blood at last." A pair of weather-beaten, ragged-bearded heads turned to examine her. Hats were lifted to reveal long, matted hair. They wore buff leather overcoats caked with salt and high-sided, scuffed brown boots. As they stood somewhat stiffly, the thick leather creaked, and Mary caught a whiff of sea and sweat and mildew, as if they'd been fished up from the bed of the Atlantic. "Mary," continued Gookin, "these are 2 good friends of mine who shared the crossing with me, Colonel Edward Whaley and his son-in-law, Colonel William Gough." Whaley said, "Indeed, it is a pleasure to meet you, Mrs. Gookin." She forced a smile and glanced at her husband. 2 colonels? But already he'd withdrawn his hand and was moving to help the pair down from the cart. She noticed how deferential he was in their presence, and how, when they put their feet to the ground after so many weeks at sea, both men swayed slightly and laughed and steadied one another. The children gawped. Colonel Gough, the younger, said, "Let us give thanks for our deliverance." Beneath his beard he had a fine, keen, pious face. His voice carried a musical lilt. He held up his hands, palms flat, and cast his eyes to the heavens. The Gookin family quickly wrenched their fascinated gaze from him and lowered their heads. We remember Psalm 107, "Oh, that men would praise the Lord for his goodness and for his wonderful works to the children of men, they that go down to the sea in ships, that do business in great waters. These see the works of the Lord and his wonders in the deep. Amen." Amen. "And who do we have here?" asked Colonel Whaley. He moved along the line of children, collecting their names. At the end, he pointed to each in turn. "Mary, Elizabeth, Daniel, Sam, Nathaniel. Very good. I am Ned, and this is Will." Nathaniel said, "Did you know the Lord Protector, Ned?" "I did, very well." "He's dead, you know." "Hush," said Mrs. Gookin. "Yes, Nathaniel, that he is," replied Ned sadly. "More's the pity." There was a silence. Mr. Gookin clapped his hands. "Boys, fetch the Colonel's bags for them." Until that moment, Mary Gookin had nursed a hope that her husband had merely offered the men a ride. Now, as she watched them unload their luggage from the cart and hand it to her sons, she felt dismay. It was hardly the homecoming she'd dreamed of, to feed and shelter 2 senior officers of the English army. "And where are we to put them, Daniel?" She spoke quietly so they couldn't hear, and took care not to look at her husband, the easier to keep her temper. "The boys can give up their beds and sleep downstairs." "And how long are they to stay?" "As long as is necessary." "And what is that? A day? A month? A year?" "I can't say." "And why here? Are there no rooms to be had in Boston? Are colonels too poor to pay for their own beds?" "The governor believes Cambridge a safer lodging place than Boston." Safer. "You've consulted the governor about their accommodation?" "We've been with him half the day. He gave us dinner." So that was why his journey from Boston had taken him so long. She watched the boys struggling under the weight of the large bags, the 2 colonels walking behind them towards the house, talking to the girls. To her feelings of dismay and irritation was suddenly added an altogether sharper emotion, fear. "And why," she began hesitantly, "why does the governor believe Cambridge is safer than Boston?" "Because Boston is full of rogues and royalists, whereas here they'll be among the godly." "They're not visitors from England, then, so much as fugitives?" He made no answer. "And from what is it they run?" Gookin took a while to reply. By the time he spoke, the men had gone inside. He said quietly, "They killed the king."
It's such a good opening chapter. It draws you in immediately. You have this reversal after reversal. Is Gookin turning up? He's hours late. Has he drowned in the Atlantic? And then he turns up, and then the men are with him. I love those first few pages. I was immediately hooked, and then hooked in for the rest of the novel. They're followed by their tormentor, their pursuer, Richard Naylor. Tell us about him.
Well, Naylor's the character I made up. I mean, most of the characters in the novel are real, a bit like An Officer and a Spy, where I think every character was real. But here I did have to make up one. The novel came about because a couple of years ago I was scrolling, when I should have been working actually, I was scrolling through Twitter and I saw a line, the greatest manhunt of the 17th century. I thought, oh, that sounds interesting. So I clicked on it, and it was about the hunt for the regicides. And I read, there were a couple of good books about it, I read them. And it was a fascinating story, you know, the closing of the ports, the interception of the mail, the interrogations, and the rest of it. And but it lacked a manhunt without a manhunter. And I thought, perhaps this would be a great procedural hunt in the aftermath of the English Civil War. What an interesting way to write about that English Civil War. And I wonder who did go after them. And I read a lot of very dry and boring tomes about government in the 17th century and realized it would have been run by the Privy Council, really reporting effectively to Sir Edward Hyde, the Lord Chancellor, who later became Lord Clarendon. And that there would have been a subcommittee of the Privy Council, probably the Regicide Committee, that would have dealt with the whole issue of rounding them up. Originally, they were only supposed to round up 4. That was the deal between the King and Parliament, but it got out of hand, and all names were constantly being added. And so who was in charge of this, I thought maybe the secretary or the clerk to the regicide committee. And so I invented this guy, Richard Naylor, and decked him out with certain common features from that time. And then I had to select who he would, it wasn't enough that he would be after everybody. I really needed to choose 2 or 3, and the 2 that fled to New England were obvious. And then my method is to just read everything I can. And the Whaley and Goff crop up in the diaries of John Evelyn. And Evelyn recounts going in the Christmas of 1657 on Christmas Day to attend an illegal mass on the Strand in the Marquis of Hertford's house. And as the priest was celebrating the mass, the doors burst open, soldiers poured in, and followed soon afterwards by these 2 officers, Colonel Whaley and Colonel Goff. And they interrogated the congregation. Some of them were arrested. And I thought, I will put my Richard Naylor, my regicide hunter, in that congregation. He sees these 2 men. He remembers them. And so it becomes, to put it crudely, a kind of Puritan Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. Let's be honest about it.
Naylor felt to me like a villain from a spaghetti western, on a remorseless hunt.
He's got
for
the
revenge.
white hat.
Yes.
He is not going to rest until he's got these 2.
And there's a personal vendetta, which I won't reveal. I mean,
Yes, there's a personal reason why he's after them. And so every time... There was also, if anyone here remembers the 70s, a series called Alias Smith and Jones, which these men lived under aliases in New England for years, hiding. There was a reward on their heads. They had to hide in attics and cellars and barns.
There begins this tremendous long ordeal, really, where they go from one place to another, as you say, to attics, to cellars, eventually into the wild. They're attacked by animals. They live in caves. It's a kind of living hell that these 2 men went through, isn't it?
Yeah, it was that. I thought the visceral nature of it, and of a chase, a hunt, is always a good thing in fiction. I mean, my main pleasure in fiction is to tell a story and to entertain, and to try and bring a period alive. And this seemed to me to be original, actually. Most things have been done to death, but the English Civil War has been curiously untouched by popular fiction. And this particular period, especially the aftermath of the Civil War.
Why do you think that is?
It's very complicated. I mean, you do get the impression sometimes that history is just Tudors and Nazis, and I've nothing against the Nazis. I mean, I do have things. I should rephrase that. I do have things against the Nazis, obviously.
Yes, but they've served you well.
Yes, but yes, they've fed and clothed us for some time. But why is it? Well, there's no Henry VIII. There's no glamorous wives beheaded. But I suppose, to be less facetious, it's immensely complicated. It's not just political. It's hugely religiously driven, the Civil War. It's hard for us to comprehend that. And I think that the Act of Oblivion, curiously, was so effective that after 1660, it really continued to hold. That people didn't want to revisit the Civil War in the aftermath, in the 50, 60, 70 years, 100 years after it. And it's not really until you get to Carlyle and the 19th century that you start to get people saying, oh, well, maybe there was something to be said for Cromwell and the Roundheads or the parliamentary side. Up to that point, it's very much Charles the Martyr and let's just forget about it. And I think that to a certain degree, that has lingered. We don't want to talk about it. It's reenacted by people, but they like dressing up in the costumes and getting out in the open air with the weapons, but I don't think they're actually fighting the ideology of the war.
No, and I found myself, as I read it, not really knowing which side I would have been on. I mean, nor do I sense which side you would have been on.
I realised that most people would be on the side of people running. You are, whether it's Bonnie and Clyde or whoever. You're on the side of people running. You don't want to see them caught, especially as the penalty if you're caught is so horrible. But at the same time, I also had some sympathy for Naylor, and you can't celebrate Christmas. I mean, what is this? This is religious repression. I can understand the desire, this like almost hatred of being told that you can't celebrate Christmas, for instance, or you can't go to the theatre. One shouldn't forget that these guys were like the kind of Taliban of the militant Protestantism. You'd be carted off if you wanted to go to the theatre. Icons destroyed. All that thing we've become familiar with in the 21st century through Islam was happening in the 17th century here in this country.
Yes, I find the description of the Puritanism in New England and the different strands of it in the different towns and this archipelago of settlements. I mean, what were the 30,000 people there?
We have 30,000 in the 16th
And Whaley and Goff
century,
go from one place to the other as they get pursued and chased down by their hunters and by the royalists. But what comes across so strongly in your book is the world they were in. This the Mosaic Code and the idea that 1666 would somehow solve everything. I found that fascinating.
Yes, it's a real. I mean, I didn't really realise the extent to which. If you imagine sailing 3,000 miles to sort of trek into nearly 100 miles or so into the interior of wild country, really, to build a settlement, to try and grow crops, to cling on by your fingernails to existence here. Only people with powerful religious zeal, almost reckless of their own lives, could do such a thing. So these were really political, religious radicals, most of them. And it's from this soil, this DNA, that modern America, to some degree, comes. And I really, you can't really understand America, it seems to me. I don't, and I wouldn't pretend to be an expert on America, but you can see in modern America the roots of the country with this strong religious strand in the political settlement, prohibition, the overturning of Roe v. Wade, the predominance of religion in politics is very strong still.
Yes, it's the clash of moral certainties which one sees here and one sees echoes of in contemporary life.
And the Puritan Revolution, the failed Cromwellian Revolution, sails across in a kind of arc to America and is preserved there because a lot of these people, like Gookin, returned from America to fight for the New Model Army or be part of the Cromwellian regime. And when that failed, they continued. Whaley and Goff drilled the militia in New Haven and said, with 200 such men, we would have no fear of the king. So more than 100 years before the American War of Independence, there is already this anti-royalist, strong kind of independent streak already beginning to grow.
Do you find it surprising that Whaley and Goff didn't do something different? They seem to be passive victims of their situation. They seem to be on the run. Here are these colonels. Why weren't they turning around and taking another course? Or do you think that would have been
I don't think they had much choice, really. I mean, Naylor observes at one point London had a population of 400,000. They'd have been better off trying to hide in London than trying to hide in a population of 30,000 who are spread out in isolated communities where a stranger sticks out like a sore thumb and where the reward is £100 a head to hand them over. So they were paralyzed. They had to stay out of sight. They lived like Anne Frank. They could only emerge after dark and into the garden for a little bit. Their lives were appallingly constrained. And some of the regicides who were hanged, drawn and quartered, Colonel Jones, I think, was one of them, said, how much better it is to be us to go through the agony now than to be on the run like all these others. We will go straight to God and they will just have to linger down here. And I suspect that Colonel Goff, the more religious of the two, certainly felt that he felt he should have just handed himself in at the beginning.
Yes. One could feel that until one reads your descriptions of what happened to those who were hung, drawn and quartered.
Yes.
And I would rather be in an attic in New England, I think.
Yes, I'm with you there. I think I would not like... Hang, drawn and quartered is a kind of phrase that, doesn't seem to mean very much, but it does mean hang to the point of blacking out, cut down, castrated first, and then to have your entrails dragged out in front of you and burned in front of you. And actually, this is a long process. You know, there's 30 feet of entrails.
You don't lose consciousness for
no, and
as
so
quickly as you might hope.
but almost without exception, the men that faced this did it with almost some of them cheerfulness that they were going to meet God, and a cheerfulness in the face of death, matched by that of Charles I, who died also on the scaffold, convinced that he was going from a corruptible to an incorruptible kingdom, as he put it, and that this would, you know, it was important to die well, and you have to put these things in a novel. It is only a paragraph in the book. I don't want to put anyone off. You know, you can skip it. But I wanted to put it in because this is, you know, this is what it was like. You can't sugarcoat the past. I don't think. You have to treat it with some respect. And I was very struck by one of the regicides on the eve of facing this appalling death. Bear in mind, which began with being dragged through the streets of London on a kind of sledge or a gate, you know, over the cobbles. And for the first to have his head cut off was, to be hanged, drawn and quartered, was General Harrison. Harrison was a tough son of a bitch. And actually, when he was being disemboweled, he worked his hand free and hit the executioner and sent him reeling. And when the next regicides were being dragged out for their fate, the head of Colonel Harrison had been impaled on the sledge and was staring down at them, so that they knew where they were going. But one of the regicides on the eve of this said, you know, we should not fear this, because this is no worse than what the most ordinary woman goes through in childbirth. And I was very struck writing the novel how many of these regicides and these figures, they were on their second wife, their second marriage, because the first wife had almost invariably died in childbirth. It was a brutal, painful time, which I assume is why religion was so important, that there had to be some explanation for this, some means of getting through it psychologically, and that could only be that there was a higher purpose.
And tell us about George Downing, who was a real-life regicide. He was doing the same work in Europe, is that correct? In Holland?
No. Well, Downing was an awful man, actually.
But from where Downing Street takes its name.
Yes, how appropriate is that, really? He was brought up in New England, was trained in Harvard College, which is effectively a kind of seminary for Puritans, to be a minister. When the Civil War broke out, he returned to England. He was taken up by Colonel Oakey, John Oakey, and was the chaplain to his regiment. He came to the notice of Cromwell, who rather admired his zeal and made him in the end ambassador to Holland in The Hague, where when Cromwell died, he then saw the way the wind was blowing and started passing secrets to Charles, the exiled king's court. He was then rewarded by the incoming regime and continued as ambassador in The Hague, and then lured his confederates, including Colonel Oakey, to a meeting in The Hague where they were arrested, and they, on promise of meeting their wives, they came to this meeting, and then they were themselves hanged, drawn and quartered, with Oakey calling down God's vengeance on Downing on the scaffold. Yes. So Downing is a particularly repulsive figure, a really awful man.
And do you think the legacy of the Civil War delivered something? I mean, if you think about the timing of the Civil War and what happened afterwards, we have the scientific revolution, the Enlightenment, the coffee shops, all this happened afterwards. Do you think one was the result of the other?
I think we were very lucky. I think that the accession of the new king has served to bring home the language of the 17th century settlement, the emphasis on the Church of Scotland, for instance, which one saw that first weekend. This is really where our constitutional settlement dates back to 1660, the Act of Oblivion, and then obviously 1688, the deal done between Parliament and the monarch then, and it has served us well, I think, and it did help usher in, this is the time when the Royal Society is starting, Newton and the scientific advances, the coffee shops, the Western design, the expansion of British power, is all sort of begins in this period. And I started the book always thinking that I'd have been a kind of, round head, probably. Now I realise I'm one of life's cavaliers, and I would have been probably a moderate parliamentarian, and so would have been squashed flat by the political radicals in the army.
Neither one thing nor the other.
Yes, because it was a military takeover, military dictatorship. I don't think there's any point in glossing over that. And in my youth, I'd have been kind of Republican. As most people would say it's absurd to have this family hereditary thing, but when you look at America now with Trump and the difficulties of running together head of state and government, I think there is a wisdom in the separation of the two. And I must say, one of the most reassuring images of the last few days has been to see the King greeting the new Prime Minister, going, "You again? Oh dear, oh dear." Come on. And it gave you a sort of feeling of, oh, well, there are, we will go on,
yes.
We'll get through it somehow or other.
But at the same time, perhaps without Charles I being beheaded, we wouldn't have a Charles III. Do you think there's some element of readjustment, which
I think it may be true. The thing is, anyone who looks at this period, and I really wanted to put Cromwell and Charles I in the book, which I'm able to do because I imagine Whaley writing a memoir of his life, which a lot of the people at that time did, survivors of the Civil War, and he had time on his hands to do it, and he was close to Cromwell. And Cromwell said, "We will cut off the king's head with a crown upon it." That is, Charles I was very difficult to deal with. There would never have been peace as long as Charles I was around. They knew that because he felt empowered to lie, because he could say one thing and really no, with his fingers crossed behind his back, he would renege on it. So there was no deal to be done with him. But it's possible to envisage they could have done a deal with another Stuart and set them on the throne, but Cromwell said, no, we will cut off the king's head with a crown upon it, not only get rid of him, get rid of the monarchy, abolish the House of Lords, abolish the bishops. They really, really went for it. And it didn't work, actually, is the truth, that people wouldn't follow a parliamentary committee, however well-intentioned or well-staffed, and into this power vacuum stepped Cromwell himself. Whether he'd always thought of that as a likely possibility, or whether he merely responded to the voice of God, who knows? He's a complex figure. He might not even be able to answer that question himself. But I think the fact that we tried it for 11 years and it didn't work probably inoculated us against republicanism.
Yes, there's a line in your novel where you have Cromwell saying, England cannot be, one thing we've discovered is England cannot be ruled by a committee.
I think that's true.
Yes.
You need something to focus on, and it may be completely irrational. When I look at that poor the Prince of Wales' son, whose life is mapped out for him forever, and he's almost, it seems to me, almost a terrible fate to inflict upon someone, that his life is not his to live as he would wish, but merely to be our kind of icon. There is something peculiar about this, but then on the other hand, if we're learning nothing else these days, it's that politics isn't really rational, life isn't really rational, and you have to, if the irrational has worked, probably stick with it. See how right-wing I'm becoming.
I know. What happened to the old lefty?
I know, but there we go. What I wish, as I kind of drift rightwards, is there was just the sort of Tory party to vote for that wasn't just a bunch of lunatics. I feel like I'm owed a Macmillanite kind of Tory party, and instead I've just got an English nationalist lunatic party.
one thread that runs. I mean, you've written a novel, a brilliant novel, but set in an entirely new period of history for you, with new characters and a new story. But for me, it's touching on really the same themes that draw you in every time, or most of the time, around power, around inflection points in history. Do you think that's true? And what attracts you to power? Have you always been attracted to power?
Yeah, I know what you want, and I'm going to tell the story yet again. When I was 6 years old, my parents went to my school for the parents' evening, and everyone's work was pinned up around the classroom. My pet rabbit, where we went on holiday, and my contribution was why me and my dad don't like Sir Alec Douglas Hume. And as a friend pointed out, I've gone on writing the same thing ever since. So I had a sort of weird kind of interest in politics right from the start. My father had been a victim of the polio epidemic in the 20s when he was only 18 months old. So he couldn't really play sport. He had a pronounced limp. And so I never grew up in a household where my father and I would follow football, but he was passionately interested in politics and current events, and that became our kind of football, I think. And so I always took great interest in it, and almost studied it as people might study the game of football. You know, the moves, the tactics, the team management, and so on. And the great game of politics has always been something like that for me. And I'm fascinated by people who pursue power. It's the drama, the theatre of politics, which we're witnessing now. We're all kind of living in a thriller in a way as to what on earth will happen next. And that, the way, I suppose I put this most in the Cicero trilogy, but the way that politics calls forth so much from an individual, exposes their weakness with pitiless clarity, and the folly of ambition, and the inevitable failure of a political career, as Enoch Powell so famously wrote about. All that to me that's my, piece of ivory to write.
And you never wanted to be a politician yourself?
Not really, no. I mean, I sort of, I'm not really a joiner of a party.
You went into journalism.
Yes, and the moment you go into journalism and are studying it from the outside, then I think that you look at it differently. And I think it's very important, well, in this novel, that I'm not really either on one side or another. I think that a novelist who is purely political, agit-prop, does a disservice, actually, because life is so complicated, and I think one of the jobs of a writer is to express the complication of life, not simply to sloganeer.
The nuance.
I mean, as I get older, I just simply can't stand listening to these politicians on the Today programme telling you things they don't believe in themselves. A line they may have to hold until lunchtime, and then they'll be back the next day saying the complete opposite. And they wonder why there's no respect.
Yes. Last time you were here, or maybe the time before, you were talking about Munich, and your book about Munich, and I was sitting somewhere back there, and behind me was an up-and-coming politician called Kwasi Kwarteng, taking notes.
God rest his soul.
I've heard you say before that some leaders have gone on too long, and there's a sort of shelf life that you've seen happen. I mean, he didn't have much of a shelf life. When you look at
the Mayfly, I think, has a longer.
Yes. When you look at your old friend Tony Blair, he was probably the person you've known best in the political arena over the last. Is that the case over the last few decades?
Well, they got to the very top, yes. I would think that I did know him pretty well, and I'd always be grateful for the fact that he invited me to follow him around, and I was able to spend time in that 97 election campaign. It was a few weeks, but I got as much out. There's a great line of Henry James about one particular summer in the 19th century that he went on holiday with all his friends and family, and he said he got as much out of that summer that he needed to write novels for the rest of his life, or short stories.
I love it.
And in a funny way, I felt that covering those few weeks that I saw enough firsthand that I saw what someone who's about to be Prime Minister acts like, looks like, how people start to behave around them and so on, stood me in great good stead, you know, to feel that one had seen that. And I do think that again, these are kind of universal rules, but I think that after 5, certainly 8 years, most politicians who've got to the top do start to go slightly mad. I think that is, I've seen that again and again. And
How long do you think they should be allowed before they
I
start
think
going mad?
probably the American 8 years is about the right 2
I
terms.
think there's a reason. There's a sort of,
Yeah,
without
because-
even knowing it, there's a reason for that.
Yeah, and I think that after that it should be compulsory retirement. And one of the terrifying features of the modern world is Putin going on for 20-odd years. He's gone mad in power. Almost anyone would. Absolute power and parting company with reality. Julius Caesar went crazy. Why was he assassinated? Partly because he was about to go on a round-the-world conquest tour for 2 years, so he appointed every magistrate for the next 2 years. Well, for every one man you appoint, you make 5 or 10 very, very angry. It's no surprise he was assassinated. He parted company with reality. He actually thought he'd become a god, which even Tony Blair didn't go quite that far. And, you know, the president of China, again, it's a terrifying thing for the world that he's heading towards 15 years or job for life, because you go crazy, and you know, you wherever you look, you see that. I mean, you could even argue that for the first few years, Hitler was not insane, but around the time of his 40th, 48th, 49th birthday, he started to think that, you know, things must be done within my lifetime. You know, craziness set in and disaster follows.
I'm going to turn to the audience in 1 second for questions, so please be ready. Do you tell me what happens next in British politics? What would you like to happen next? Are you is Keir Starmer fill you with excitement?
I don't think Keir Starmer's filled with excitement himself with Keir Starmer, let alone any of the rest of us. Well, all I would say is that I was talking to a senior Conservative politician who's been here this weekend, mentioning no names, but I said, does the Tory party, will they want Liz Truss to lead them at the next general election? Well,
Fairly fundamental question.
You can imagine the
Yes.
answer. Well, if that is the answer, is it better to get rid of her now, quickly, or later? And again, the question almost answers itself. So that would be my hunch, but I have no idea how things will pan out. Every prediction I ever make is now wrong. I couldn't, so who knows what may happen.
Yeah.
But it's a thrilling time. You know, I'm here as a thriller writer, is the title of our talk. But I would say I was more a political writer, but to write political novels, it's really to write thrillers, because they are about conspiracy and ambition and espionage and all that sort of thing. They look out to the world. And so, politics is one giant rolling thriller, really.
Let's have some questions. Let's start over there, middle on the left, please.
Hello, this question may be answered when I read your book, but I was wondering, did Gough and Whaley, like their fellow regicides, Lambert and I think Harrison, were they involved in the manhunt for Charles II after the Battle of Worcester?
I don't know whether they were directly involved in that, but of course, I mean, they all knew one another. They certainly supported Lambert in 1660 when he escaped from the Tower and tried to raise the army against the deal which was being proposed by Parliament. So they were on the run from sort of March, April 1660, even before the deal was done to bring back the king. They narrowly escaped death and capture when Lambert was arrested. And so, they were, but they knew well, of course, all the people that had signed the death warrant. The signing of the death warrant, the King's trial, is worthy of a novel in itself, and the signing of the death warrant, where by the middle of the morning, Cromwell didn't feel he'd got enough signatures on it, so he went storming down to the lobby of the House of Commons and said, I will go in there, they will set their hands, and burst through the doors and started hauling men out. You, and you, come and sign the death warrant. And sort of with a degree of reluctance, a few of them went. It's a myth that he forced their hands, but certainly a lot of them rued the day that they had put their hands to the warrant. They knew that this would be a great, this was an extraordinary thing to do. And what no one thought was that Colonel Hacker, to whom the warrant was given, Colonel Hacker, incidentally, could you even begin to, as a novelist, make up such a
Nominative determinism.
Yes,
Yep.
yes. Cromwell gave the warrant to Colonel Hacker, who commanded the troops at the execution, and Hacker kept it as a kind of souvenir in his house in Leicestershire. It was, of course, and he thought that this would exonerate him because he hadn't signed the death warrant. So he told the prosecutors about it, and his wife was sent to fetch it from the country with a man, is all that's specified in the House of Lords as orders. So the man becomes Naylor. And of course, no, he didn't sign it, but it's addressed to him. So, it doesn't exactly exonerate him.
No, it's not a great look,
no,
is it?
No.
Another question. Let's have the one just here. Yep.
Your books cover a lot of different countries, a lot of different time periods. How hard do you think about how to voice the characters in your books, in your time periods, in your countries?
Well, that's a very good question, because in the end, a book is language, and you have to have authentic language or feel, I think. I mean, I don't really like pastiche, 17th century prose. I'd rather favour the Robert Bolton Man for All Seasons dialogue, where you believe that these are the issues of Tudor England, but they aren't speaking in cod Tudorese, as it were. But the language is incredibly rich and powerful. I always remember during unsuccessful efforts to improve my French, the idea that the language of the King James Bible is very similar to French. So they know not what they do is a classic French construction to this day. We don't say, they wouldn't have said in those days, they don't know what they're doing. So I would try to keep to that kind of language structure, if I can, without making it difficult for the reader. And the powerful nature of the language. Cromwell, I read all his speeches and letters in preparation for writing the book. And there's after the Battle of Marston Moor, his brother-in-law's son was killed, and he wrote to his brother-in-law, Valentine Walton, to say, we have won a great victory, credit all to God. He always said that. I have to tell you, your son was killed. His leg was taken off by a cannonball. We tried to save him, but it was impossible. He was much loved by the army. You know how I have suffered this way myself. His own son had died the previous year. He said, but there he is, gone to glory, to know pain and sin no more. And that kind of construction, sentence construction and language, tells you a lot about Cromwell and a lot about the way they spoke in those days, the poetry of it, really. And so I did try and convey that if I could in the book.
One of the narrative techniques you use a lot is the secondary character being the main character in your novel. So we have here, we don't have Cromwell, we don't have Charles II, we have these men on the hunt, and you have men on the run, and then you have Hugh Leggett and Paul Hartman in Munich, and you have Tyro the slave in the Cicero books, and you have the ghostwriter. So there's always is that liberating in a way for you? Is that a conscious thing you do, which allows you to take the outsider's view on these big characters who sometimes just make fleeting appearances in your novels?
Yes, I think that I do tend to do that. I like doing that. It's first of all, it reflects my own kind of role as an observer. You know, the awestruck, kind of surprised private secretary, ghostwriter, whatever, is the kind of role I think I would have fulfilled, and if I'd been around these days. Also, if you're describing Cicero. You can't really do an I, Claudius as a first-person narration because Cicero was a genius, and it'd be, you know, Sotero is a kind of Dr. Watson to the Sherlock Holmes of Cicero, and it's easier to describe that great talent from outside.
Yeah.
So that is a role that I like, the kind of Rosencrantz and Guildenstern role, you know, observing events as they go wheeling by.
Yes.
I do like doing that. Yeah, and find an offbeat way of writing about a story, about, say, the Dreyfus affair, from the point of view of Colonel Picard, completely really now forgotten by history. But he was the whistleblower, the dynamic figure in it. And so to tell it from his point of view suddenly cast the whole thing in a different light.
Yeah, yeah. Let's have another question. Let's have one at the front.
Jack Blackburn, The Times. You've written novels of numerous different natures, but history is clearly something you come back to. What draws you to write historical fiction?
It doesn't date, actually. I think that's part of the reason. People say, oh, well, surely now, the politics now would make a great novel, but it would be out of date. If I started writing tomorrow, it would be out of date within... Yes, exactly. The great thing about history is it does enable you to stand back and to write something, if you can, true about the past, to not kind of infect it too much. I thought Hilary Mantel was very right to say that you shouldn't twist history to try and fit the template of today. You should just let it speak for itself. But it doesn't date if you can get it right. So the Cicero books, people go on reading and they're not. Whereas if I'd written a novel about, say, New Labour, it would have been dead as a doornail now. It would be like, you know, the great novelist in his day, Angus Wilson, but who really reads Angus Wilson anymore, you know? Whereas I think the idea is always to universalize if you can. I mean, one of the great TV series is Dad's Army. Dad's Army is as fresh today as it was 40 years ago, 50 years ago actually, when it was made, because it's a perfect snapshot of England at that time. And you can't do it better now. And you know, I feel that if you can do that with historical fiction, then it can go on being read. And all novelists, I think, aim at a kind of universalism. You know, that what you write has a kind of truth that transcends the words on the page, the time in which it's set, and the books of mine that have probably dated the fastest are the contemporary ones. And the older they are, the less they date, is the truth. I'm hoping this one won't date very much, therefore.
Are the rules clear, though? Because one thinks of Hilary Mantel, and some people think her interpretation of the Tudor period is slanted. And then, you know, there's a controversy today about Peter Morgan and the Crown and the representation of Prince Charles and how that twists the facts. Do you feel there's a sort of understanding of where historical fiction can go and where it can't go?
Well, you know, by its nature, a drama about Prince Charles is not really historical fiction. I mean, that I would say is contemporary. I think I take a kind of heretical view, and I think the Crown has done the royal family nothing but good in some ways. That it is, if you're going to be this hugely powerful global brand, have Netflix make one of its most popular series about you. You may not particularly like it, but boy, does it reinforce the sense of being central to world events and the 4 billion people who watched the Queen's funeral, so we're told. I mean, that is globalism. And, you know, I fear that something like The Crown is something that goes with the territory if you're going to do that. And it's not necessarily, therefore, that bad a thing. I mean, nobody really takes it literally, do they? I'm not sure that they do.
I don't know.
Maybe they
Let's
do.
have another question. Over here.
One of the sort of subtitles on the talk was about adaptations of your books, presumably referencing the Netflix film of Munich and the French language film of Officer and Spy. A couple of years ago, I was lucky enough to be taken by my parents to see the theatre adaptation of the Cicero trilogy at the RSC. What's the process like of seeing your books adapted into film and stage productions? Is it something that you've helped with, and are there any of your books you particularly want to see adapted to stage or screen productions?
Well, it's, you know, there is no set pattern to it, to be honest. Some are really good and some are less good, and you just have to swallow it. The advice of Kingsley Amis was take the money and run. And I think there's something in that. You can't really control it. Obviously, the two that I wrote the screenplay for, I'm particularly fond of.
Which were they?
They were The Ghost and An Officer and a Spy. Officer and a Spy not having been shown in the English-speaking world because of the effective boycott of Roman Polanski. But it's great. I mean, I love the Cicero adaptation by the RSC, and I liked Munich very much, and I was quite involved in that because I knew or know Jeremy Irons, and so I was able to help bring him in to play Chamberlain, which I think was crucial to the success of that. They're about to start filming the film of Conclave, with Ralph Fiennes as the Cardinal, the Dean of the College of Cardinals, and Stanley Tucci and Isabella Rossellini as the nun. I'm looking forward to that. So yeah, no, it's great. I mean, on the whole, obviously it's wonderful to see your work go into another dimension and to meet the actors and.
Is Act of Oblivion heading our way on the screen?
Yes, there were a couple of. There's one offer to make it into a TV series. It may well be made into that, but I'm not going to be able to determine whether it's success or not. You know, I mean, I don't like the adaptation of Fatherland. Some people do, but I really can't bear it. It seems to me to be against the whole spirit of the novel. But you know, if the rights have gone, there's nothing I can do. I mean, as they say, it's like selling your house and going back a year later and complaining because the kitchen has been knocked through. Well, you know, if you don't want the kitchen knocked through, don't sell the house. That's the simple rule.
Let's have another question at the back. Right at the back, please. Man in the black polo neck.
Thanks. You use the archetype of a thriller, obviously, in a lot of your work, but politics has been approached, gonzo or satire. Are you ever tempted to change the archetype when you look at subjects?
What, and write satire rather than...
Yes.
Well, as they say on Broadway, satire is what closes Saturday night. The Ghost is quite satirical, actually. That's probably the closest that I've been. And I like writing that book because I quite like making jokes, really. And one of the problems with thrillers is a comic thriller is an oxymoron, really, because you can't be laughing away and also be, you know, in alarm about the fate of the characters or whatever. So most of my books are slightly more po-faced than I'd like them to be. And I'm endlessly going around saying, oh, well, my theme is the collapse of civilizations, how unsafe the world is. At any given moment, it may give way beneath our feet. This isn't really my temperament, to be honest with you.
You're an optimist.
I am by nature an optimist, yes. I think that we always every generation's faced huge problems. Actually, the problems faced by my parents and grandparents' generation, they would kind of laugh at the idea of our problems that we're facing now. They would seem as nothing to them, probably, except possibly climate change, obviously. But otherwise, they would say, I think that human ingenuity generally gets us through, and a kind of... so I am optimistic, and if you're not optimistic, I don't know really, it would be very hard to go on from day to day, I think.
Well, on that optimistic note, let's stop. I want to encourage you all to, after we've finished, to go through to the bookshop, and Robert will be signing copies of his really wonderful novel. I can't urge you enough to read it. I read it in 2 sittings and absolutely loved it, and Robert, many congratulations on that. And thank you.
Thank you.